The Center Square is a nonpartisan, fact-based newsroom, ranked by impartial media bias watchdogs as closer to the center than other respected news organizations. And we lead other outlets on important stories impacting you in your backyard. Here's yet another example. A Washington Attorney General's office spokesman told reporters there was no story in an exclusive by the Center Square showing the office communicating with legislators about the Millionaires tax in Washington, dismissing the investigation as, quote, misinformation and, quote, nonsense. That's according to new internal emails. Now, detractors of the tax are asking if such advice in those emails is normal, and is that seriously the kind of advice the Attorney General gives people? Here's how to pull this trick off. Well, joining us to talk about this story is the Center Square investigative reporter, TJ Martinell. TJ, thanks for taking time. You've been digging into this for quite some time, and it all centers around this law that came together to bring about a progressive income tax, and even though previous court rulings slapped this down over the past 100 years. So your reporting revealed some internal communications that state legislators, the Washington Attorney General's office had, and not only revealing that, but other media were interested in what those communications had to say.
Right.
So ultimately, why should taxpayers be tracking this story and what I expect to be some ongoing developments?
Well, I mean, this is taxpayer-funded Attorney General's office talking to a taxpayer-funded elected official about how to craft a tax that could legalize another kind of tax, which is a progressive income tax, which voters, taxpayers in the state have rejected 10 times since the 1930s. So regardless of whether or not this was inappropriate, unethical, illegal, that's all moot, because it's still something that the public should know, because potentially they could be paying this tax. They could be filing an income tax return in Washington state, and they already have to do one for the federal government. And so one of the issues is that they call it a millionaire's tax. And so people think, oh, it doesn't apply to me. Well, even if it's not directly applying to you, it's indirectly applying to you when people are leaving the state over it, that fund your organizations, donate to your nonprofits, or hire you. But also the purpose of the tax is to lead to another form of an income tax. So the notion that this is just intended to be for a specific group of people making a certain amount of income that's not the plan. And so also the idea that they're using taxpayer funded resources to advance a political agenda, which is getting a progressive income tax legalized. At the very least, this is stuff that taxpayers should know about. It's as if the city council in a town passed an increase to the sales tax, and the newspaper wrote about it, and the city spokesperson said, well, there's nothing wrong with what they did. Well, okay, that doesn't change the fact that it affects the people in this town who have to pay the new sales tax.
Well, and it's also just, the idea of how are these things crafted? I mean, taxpayers should know how their elected representatives are having conversations with the taxpayer-funded Attorney General's office, especially for an issue like this. So let's rewind back to April, when the Center Square story initially published about the initial documents you received, the internal communications, and it was about those documents describing the Attorney General's office lawyers advising on how to challenge that nearly 100 years of Washington Supreme Court precedent. What was the initial reaction from the AG's office when that story first published?
I mean, internally, they were furious about the story, and they felt like it wasn't a story, and they thought that it's just interesting how they acted as if I was creating a narrative as opposed to just reiterating what they said in these emails. I mean, we literally say in the headline what the prime sponsor for the Millionaires tax said in these emails, and then they act like we're just making it's almost, some of the comments and communications were borderline an alternative reality. That's my response to it, is they're saying that we're making stuff up when we're literally just quoting the emails and documents.
You're just putting a mirror up to it, right? I mean, you weren't necessarily you yourself characterizing the value of this information back and forth. Again, it's important information for taxpayers to understand how this particular policy change that passed the legislature came about. Right. So what's great about obtaining internal government emails, it's not just confirmation that they're public records and should be accessible because taxpayers fund the government, but many times it shows taxpayers how their government works internally. It obviously, there was a story here because your records request led to other media
Right.
inquiries about this issue. Now,
Yeah.
Washington AGO Deputy Communications Director Mike Falk is shown in the most recent batch of emails you got, pushing back on the Center Square story. What were some of the things that you found in your most recent records request that he was telling other media outlets?
I mean, I think the issue is that he wasn't just trying to provide information. He was trying to construct a narrative, and was making very inflammatory remarks about our news organization and our coverage of the Attorney General's office. And him saying that there's nothing to this story just doesn't. I'm sorry, but no. If any editor worth their salt, if they found out a reporter of theirs had gotten these records and not written a story about it because they didn't think it was a story, they'd be fired on the spot. You cannot have that kind of mindset and work in journalism or in the media. This was probably, and this wasn't just my opinion. I mean, my personal opinion when I saw the records, I was like, this is the biggest story I've probably ever am going to write, at least up until this point. Who knows what happens moving forward, knock on wood. But I just thought this is the biggest story I've ever seen in my journalism career.
Being able to get those types of records, right? I mean, you don't really see
Right.
attorneys and their clients' records. Those are typically privileged, but I mean, these are all elected officials doing the people's business. So the people should know what's being done behind these types
Right.
of conversations. But I mean, to say that the Center Square's misleading narrative is nonsense or the story is one
Well, they
of
didn't
their
even get it
dumbest
accurate.
yet, yeah,
They,
it's
they're we pointed out that the fact is it could lead potentially to a progressive income tax that would apply to every Washington resident. That's not what it says in our headline. Our headline says this millionaire's tax is to legalize a progressive income tax, and the spokesperson for the Attorney General's office like mischaracterized the headline, and so it's just they don't seem to be able to get the facts straight, and they also seem to equate people that we interview with our own personal views. When I interview Rob McKenna, the former state attorney general who criticized the communications, or when I interview Jackson Maynard with the Citizen Action Defense Fund, who's involved in the lawsuit against the millionaire's tax, when I quote them or feature their interviews, that's their opinions. I'm not I'm not writing an editorial column. I'm not writing an opinion piece. I'm getting other people to comment. And that's the other thing, is that you had the former state attorney general, Rob McKenna, who's also involved in the lawsuit against the millionaire's tax. He criticized communications. You had a former state Supreme Court justice who's also involved in the lawsuit against the income tax, criticizing these communications. And then, you've had, like you said, other media outlets immediately jumped on this story and wanted to get involved. You had one reporter who requested the same records as I did hours after my story broke. Clearly, they thought that this was worth looking into. And so telling people that public communications officers telling reporters that there's no story here, sorry, that's really not, I would dare to say that's really not their place to tell media whether or not there's a story. That's the job of the media to decide. And that's the job of taxpayers and people who, viewers, who can reach out and say, we didn't really find anything interesting about it. And the fact that it blew up all over the state, the number of people I've run into who've seen the coverage of this stuff, and the fact that the Attorney General, Nick Brown, was actively involved in crafting the media responses to other media outlets, either he has nothing better to do with his time, or this was an actual story that he felt like he wanted to be involved in the response.
right.
So they can't have it both ways. And this is not the first case where they've said that there's no story here. And when I've reached out to them,
it happens a lot all across the state, no question. But somebody else you reached out to, and I think it's important to include this, is the Center Square publisher Chris Krug,
Right.
and he provided a statement for this, and we'll just go ahead and read that. The statement says, Mr. Falk has called our reporting misinformation and nonsense to newsroom after newsroom. In none of these emails to media outlets did he name a single thing we got wrong, because he can't. The facts are confirmed by other journalists that he emailed. He's trying to end the reporting without answering what it raised, who received unredacted records, how attorney-client privilege was handled, and his office's role in shaping this bill. He can't have it both ways. So what are other, the detractors out there? You mentioned a few names. What are they saying about all this?
As far as trackers, as other media outlets?
No, detractors, those who are opposing the tax. Yeah.
I mean, the people opposing the tax, they're pointing out that It's different for the Attorney General's office to issue legal advice on how to avoid getting a lawsuit, or saying, for example, Governor Ferguson's office, he had personnel reach out to the Attorney General's office and say, hey, we're looking at this high income earner tax and we want to know what are the odds or probability of it surviving a legal challenge. And so they wrote a legal memo, which I also obtained unredacted. And there's nothing wrong with them asking for legal advice. That, again, it's a client asking their attorney for how to do, the legality of something that they want to do within legislating. The difference is that the Attorney General's office was actively involved in writing this bill specifically so that it would lead to a Supreme Court ruling outcome. And so that's different. And we're not talking about one ruling that occurred 5-10 years ago. We're talking about a series of legal rulings, all of which have come to the same conclusion over a 90-year period. And also the ramifications of this ruling would be enormous. It would effectively declare income to not be property. And so under our state constitution, you can't tax property at different rates. It has to be uniform by class. And that's, in our one of the amendments that they added. And so they have this definition of property that is all things tangible and intangible subject to ownership. So they're trying to claim that your income you don't own. And so that's another issue that's going on with this whole discussion. I think Washington State residents deserve to know that there are members of the Attorney General's office and also elected officials who believe that you do not own your income. As
TJ, your story impacting how other media outlets are reporting on this issue. It's impacting, of course, the taxpayers, but it's also impacting court filings. Talk a little bit about the latest in this situation when it comes to challenges against this particular law.
Yeah. So after my story broke on April 20th, there was a organization that was suing the state over the Millionaires Taxes Necessity Clause, which prevents a referendum. And that was added there, we found out, because the Solicitor General for the state made reference to the Necessity Clause, telling the prime sponsor, if you don't have a necessity clause in there or an emergency clause, that it would allow for a referendum. And so there was a supplemental brief that was added to the lawsuit, which ultimately didn't succeed, but it definitely has. I think the thing that this has done, our coverage, is it's completely transformed the narrative around the initiative that has now been, garnered enough signatures to be on the November ballot, where it's no longer a debate about the millionaire's tax itself. It's a debate about whether or not we want to legalize a progressive income tax in the state. And defenders of the tax can't defend it as a tax only on millionaires and to provide revenue for certain state services, because we know from the emails that was not its purpose.
Again, you're reporting taking something that wasn't known and revealing that to our readers and those in Washington State. We're very much going to be plugging back in with you to get the latest on this story as that continues to develop.